Hey all, welcome to day 19 with Odyssey. He's going to learn how to ground drive for the first time. So in the morning before I turned him out to his field, I did some work in the cross ties on getting him to accept treats. He's still pretty reluctant, as you can see, so I used a method where I cupped basically under his chin with my handful of treats, and as soon as it was making contact, he realized it wasn't something that was going to hurt him. And so I was able to move my hand actually towards his lips, and then he was able to take the treat from me. The problem was he was worried about the treat coming towards his mouth. He thought it might be something that hurt him, but as soon as he was actually making contact with the treat, he realized it was food and he could eat it. So what you saw there was a result of quite a bit of work and time spent off camera getting him to accept the treat. What we worked on was just a bit of target training. If you're not familiar with target training, the idea is that you hold something up, have them touch it, and as soon as they touch it, they get a reward. Sometimes the problem with getting mouth-shy horses to take treats out of your hand is they can start to be a little aggressive about it in the beginning. Now, he's not trying to bite my hand. He just thinks that's what he needs to do to get the treats out of my hand. And so I'm just patient with him, and soon it'll start to go away as he realizes he can just pick the treats up off my hand and he doesn't have to be that dramatic about it. Then I just had him touch a couple more objects to help solidify the idea in his mind. I like to use target training a lot in my training because I find that it encourages their curiosity. So for our session in the afternoon, I cinched him up with a surcingle again, just like we did the previous day. This time I wasn't using a saddle pad because this surcingle doesn't really need one. It was just to help it be something more familiar for him. But since he was fine with that yesterday, I went ahead and didn't use the saddle pad. So I had him yield his hindquarters so that he could feel the girth on him again, and then I just had him move around with it a bit, and he didn't really care at all. Ground driving is super useful for teaching horses how to steer, stop, and back off pressure on their face or a bit if you're using a bit before you actually get on their back. This helps them bridge the gap between the cues that you use on the ground and in the saddle, which helps make the transition to becoming a riding horse even smoother. So then I started to hook up just one line at a time. The work that I had done with him previously, having ropes all around him and on him, meant that he was prepared for this and he didn't seem to care too much. And so I did a little bit of swinging the rope behind his butt so he could feel that again. And when he didn't really care, I started to have him move with the singular driveline on him. So at this point, the only line that I'm using to put any pressure on his face, and that's just to make sure he goes in the correct direction, is the line that's just attached to the halter, not through the surcingle at all. So my outside drive line is just sitting there, flopping around, helping him get used to that feeling. I want him to be perfectly comfortable with the feeling of the line behind him before I actually start to teach him to give to pressure. Because he was so good with that, I went ahead and put the second drive line on him to get him started on ground driving. So again, there's no pressure on the lines just yet. I'm just getting him to move forward and start to feel the lines on him. I'm having to do a lot of rope managing because these ropes are long and I don't want them getting tangled, as that would be a safety hazard. So here I start to put pressure on the lines for the first time. I just use my outside line independently to get him to turn into the fence, and he was really good about it. Odyssey started to get a little confused because he felt the pressure behind him and thought I was asking him to go forward, but he figured it out and he turned into the fence just like I asked. So in the beginning, it's just a whole lot of walking, giving him a release. If he gets anxious and wants to trot, he's okay to trot, but I mainly want him to walk and learn how to turn into the fence so he starts to get used to giving to that pressure. And then I thought it would be neat to show a bit of sped up training so you don't have to sit and watch through all of it, but you can get an idea of the amount of repetition that goes into building a soft and confident horse. So this was the first time I asked him to stop in a straight line on the drive lines, and he was a little confused at first. As they tend to do, they feel the outside line behind them and they think it means go forward. And then sometimes they get confused between the pressure on the two lines and they're going left, right. And then once they realize stop, I give them a nice reward. So I try to stay behind him so I can keep the pressure on the lines even and minimize any pressure on his hind legs that might be making him want to go forward. And then I just stay patient until he stops. Here I found myself almost directly behind him, which is a perfect spot to ask for a stop. But I was a little uneven with my lines, causing him to turn left and right, but then he stopped really nicely, and I always give him a nice big release when he stops when asked, and just let him stand there and process for a second. So here I start to teach him some more refined steering that we're going to need when I ride him, and so I just have him do kind of a serpentine through the middle of the round pin and work on our steering. And then another thing I was doing was working towards being able to actually stand and move behind him. This can scare some horses and he was a little nervous about it, but whenever I was able to get perfectly behind him, I asked him for a stop and rewarded. The next steering check I like to do while I'm ground driving is have them go on a smaller circle inside the round pen, and so I just had him work on circling, and I was using the fence to help me for a little bit of steering, but it was causing him to think about maybe turning and going the other way because he thought maybe that's what I was going to ask him to do next. So he was just anticipating a little bit, but I kept him moving forward, kept him on the circle, and then eventually I would start to have him change directions and do a bit of a figure eight. So this is just where he's thinking, okay, there's a fence, do you want me to go the other way like we've been doing? And I'm telling him, no, I want you to keep going the same direction. And so he's just figuring that out. He's trying to offer something because he thinks that might be what I'm asking. So then it's just the same thing the other direction, building confidence on a smaller circle as we work on our steering. Now that he's good at changing directions into the fence, I wanted to have him change directions in the middle of the round pen, and this is that figure eight that I was talking about. So I just had him switch, and he was really good at that. That is one thing I definitely want them to be able to do before I go to ride them. He offered me a nice and very soft stop here. He did walk off a bit because he was anticipating moving forward again. So then I had him back up, and his head is still low because that tends to be his default position for when he's resting and getting a break. And so I don't mind that too much. I then just asked him for one more stop, and he was nice and soft. He did still have his head a little low when I was backing him up after a second, and so I think sometimes they think that's the way they're supposed to respond to the pressure. So I don't mind it because when I work with him in hand again, I'll remind him that he can back up and he can soften to that pressure with his head a little higher. And here he actually backed up very nicely. This was beautiful, and so I quit on that. I sped up the removal of the drive lines. It takes a good bit of time, and it's good for him to be able to stand for that. So thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for Odyssey's next video where he learns how to wear a saddle.